Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. In this video we're going to use the taper attachment jig that we made in the previous video and use it to turn a number 3 Morse taper. And we'll use that in the headstock of the lathe and make it into a center for turning between centers. So I've got the tracer attachment carriage set up on the lathe here. I'll put links in the description for the build videos of making this. I have the normal carriage slid all the way down to the end, and it was easier to unbolt the clamp for the tailstock and just lift it up over and put it on this side of our standard carriage than it was for me to take apart the apron from the carriage and get this one off the machine. So that's why you see that one still all the way down there at the end. I need the tailstock with the center for turning the taper right now. So let me get the camera moved in a little bit closer and we'll go over the setup of the taper attachment again, and then we'll start turning our number 3 Morse taper. I've got the taper attachment set up, so we're using the pivot over here on the right side, and our adjustment mic is back here on the back left corner. And that's going to let us set a taper in this direction. So looking at our chart, for a Morse taper number 3, we're going to measure off 1 inch of travel to make sure we have this thing adjusted correctly and cutting the right angle. This number again is off of both sides of the taper, so we're looking for a readout of half of that, about 25 thousandths or just over on this indicator. So first I'm going to zero out this one with our travel. Hopefully you guys can see these indicators, there's not too much glare on them. Now I'm going to zero out this one. Alright, both of them are zeroed out, so now I'm going to move the carriage down 1 inch this way. Alright, that's at exactly 1 inch of travel. And over here, we're at just over 25 thousandths. So we're going to call that good enough. Let me get these indicators out of the way and some air pressure hooked up to the cylinder here, and we'll start turning our taper. We should be all set up to turn the taper now. Got a piece of 1 inch cold rolled in here and about 8 pounds of air in the cylinder down here. So if I pull this guy back, it's going to push itself forward and ride right along the edge of the taper pattern here. We're just going to keep feeding in the compound here to advance the cut and making more passes until we get the small end of the taper here down to at least 778. This should be the last pass to get the small end of the taper down to the diameter we're looking for. Let me get some of these chips cleaned up and the camera moved from right in front of the chuck, and we'll pull this guy out and test it here in the spindle of the headstock. You want to make sure there's no chips or anything inside of the spindle here when you put the center in. So I pushed a rag through a couple times, and now just one last check with my hand. Seems like a pretty good fit. There's no wiggle at all. Trying to pull it out, it's not coming out by hand. I'm pretty happy with that. Let me get the carriage here swapped back to the normal one, and we'll go ahead and finish up our center. I'm going to put on my homemade thread protector just to make sure I don't accidentally run into the spindle threads. And now I'm just going to turn this down to straight. It doesn't really matter what the diameter of it is. I just want it to be parallel, say over to somewhere in this region. Alright, I think that'll be fine. Let me get the compound swung around to cut a 60-degree center on here. I think that's all there is to it. I'm going to go ahead and leave it nice and long like this. There's probably about 1.5 inches of stick out from the spindle here. That way each time I go to use it, I can take just a couple thousandths skim cut off of here and make sure it's running perfectly true each time. There's still plenty of reach for a lathe dog to be driven by the faceplate. I've been on a bit of a shopping spree lately. Picked up a set of lathe dogs so I could do some turning between centers, and that was one of the reasons for wanting to make this. I picked up a few other things too, so let me bring you over to the bench and show you those and talk about what we're going to work on in an upcoming video. First, let me say this project could be done without the use of the taper attachment that I showed being used in this video. I don't want anyone to be turned away from trying to make a lathe center because you don't have something like this. You could make one using the compound on your lathe. Use an indicator and sweep the inside of the spindle bore to accurately set your compound, and then turn the taper with that. The problem is, at least for my lathe, the compound only has about 2 inches of travel, and a Morse Taper number 3 is over a 3-inch taper. So in order to turn the full length of the taper, you'd have to turn a portion of it and then move your carriage down and turn that and try to perfectly line up the transition so the whole taper is consistent all the way across. So not impossible, just a little bit more challenging. The taper attachment sure made it easy for me. Let's head over to the bench. The first thing I have here is just a machinery's handbook. I was tired of looking up online every time I needed a size or a thread diameter or something. And these can be found pretty inexpensive on eBay. This one's in 11th edition, and it's in pretty good shape considering I think it's 75 years old. So this is a good addition to the shop. It'll come in handy and get used a lot. This was a recent Craigslist find. A machinist was retiring and selling a bunch of his tools, so I picked up these indicators from him. The first one here is just your standard Starrett 1 inch of travel. The thing is nice and smooth and basically in brand new condition. There's pretty much no sign of use or wear on it at all. Next one is a Federal 1/4 inch of travel. Again, very smooth and in great shape. And the third one here is an Interrapid test indicator. This one probably shows the most wear out of any of these guys. There's a little bit of paint off here around the edges, but still perfectly functional, nice and smooth, and came with a box, couple of spare tips, and extra collets for holding this guy in different size holders. This is a recent eBay purchase. It's a steady rest for a 10-inch Logan, and it went relatively cheap because it needs some repair and was missing a few parts. The main thing it's missing is the bed clamp and bolt that you clamp it down to the lathe with. I actually have a spare one from restoring my lathe, so I'm all set there. What does need to be fixed is the clamping mechanism here is broken, so that'll need to be repaired. But the casting itself is perfectly fine. It's also missing one of the bolts that puts pressure on the fingers there, and these guys are worn out. They sort of all have a different radius worn into them, so I'm not really sure how that happened. But I think in the next video we'll get this guy cleaned up and repair the parts we need to and remake these either out of brass or out of steel with a bearing in the end of them. So we'll get all that done in the next video. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.